Welcome to Yoddle's Big Picture Nouns for Ancient Greek. In this video, we're going to take a big picture look at how ancient Greek nouns work. We're going to cover cases, genders, and quantities. We'll cover word order and noun endings. We'll talk about declensions, articles, and adjectives. We're covering a lot of ground. Our intended audience is the independent learner. At Yoddle, we believe the best way to independently learn ancient Greek is to read it out loud every day. That's 90% of the strategy. If you want to learn ancient Greek and you don't know where to start by learning pronunciation. Yoddle has great tools and videos to help with that. Then just start reading out loud every day. As you do a lot of reading, you'll intuitively pick up on some patterns, but other patterns will be more difficult to discern. That's where this video comes in. We want to show you the overall shape of the grammar so that while you're reading, you can start to recognize the more complex patterns. This video is going to be really helpful for you if you are already familiar with vocabulary in John 1. We'll use the Yoddle Reader to make things visual and intuitive, and we'll walk through actual examples from John chapter 1 to help you start recognizing these patterns in context. Our goal at Yoddle is to get you reading ancient Greek texts out loud as quickly as possible. That's where the real learning happens, when you read. And to make that possible, you'll need a solid grasp of the basic grammar patterns so that you can start to see and understand how the language fits together. Let's dive in. First, let's talk about word order. In English, we have a fairly standard word order that typically indicates the role each noun plays in a sentence. The girl gives the boy the book. We have three nouns. The girl is the subject. The boy is the indirect object and usually comes after the verb. The book is the direct object. Could we say this in another word order? Could we say, the book the girl gives the boy? Yeah, it takes a little extra second to process it, but it's still kind of intelligible. Could you say, gives the book the girl the boy? That's starting to make no sense. Could you say, the girl the book gives the boy? Similarly, that makes very little sense. This is because in English, the order of the words in a sentence conveys in large part their function. But what if you wanted to speak English with a truly flexible word order? How would you modify the language to do that? Well, you could put an SU after the subject and an IO after the indirect object and a DO after the direct object. So the girl gives the boy the book would turn into the girl Sue gives the boyo the book do. And if you did that, then you could change the sentence around any way you'd like and it would still be pretty clear. You could say, gives the girl Sue the book do the boyo. Or you could say, the boyo gives the girl Sue the book do. It wouldn't really matter how we scrambled the word order, the meaning would still come through crystal clear. This is essentially how ancient Greek treats nouns. If we open the Yoddle Reader, we can turn on the noun highlighter, which helps us easily identify grammar concepts visually without having to learn word endings. Let's take a look at the English translations in the first chapter of John to see the variety of word orders. In John 5, we have a subject, a direct object, and a verb. In 9, we have subject, verb, direct object. In 12, we have subject, verb, indirect object, direct object. In 18, we have direct object, subject, verb. In 33, we have subject, indirect object, verb. In 45, we have verb, subject, direct object. And then in 46, we have verb, indirect object, and subject. Ancient Greek can do this because every noun has a different ending, indicating whether it's a subject, a possessive noun, an indirect object, or a direct object. In fact, let's turn on word endings in settings in the main menu. If you look at the Greek nouns, you can see the endings in red. These endings tell us what role each noun plays in the sentence, and they also convey whether the noun is singular or plural. Tap on the word logos and click on the This Word All Forms tab. We can see that the singular is logos, but the plural is logi. So we're just changing the ending of the word to indicate that it's plural. However, you might notice that the word logos has 4 different types of singular and 4 different types of plural. This is because the singular and plural endings change based on how the noun is used in the sentence. We call these 4 categories the noun's grammatical case. If the noun is used as a subject, it's a nominative case and it has the os and the e endings. If the noun is used as a possessive, it's the genitive case and has the u and the on endings. If a noun is the indirect object, it's the dative case and it has the o and the is endings. And if the noun is a direct object, it's the accusative case and it has the on and the us endings. And so we have a pattern of 8 word endings. We have 4 cases, and each noun can either be singular or plural in that case. The first noun form, its nominative singular form, is the standard form of the noun. All others are variants of that form. So, the bad news is that each noun has many possible word endings, 8 to be exact. The good news is that this exact pattern of 8 endings by case and quantity is shared across many nouns. If we click on the Other Words Same Form tab, we see many other nouns that have the same endings. These 8 endings are a pattern that we see over and over and over again. And as we do a lot of reading, we'll get used to seeing these patterns over time. The other bad news that I didn't mention is that this isn't the only pattern of 8. In fact, there are 11 different patterns of 8, making for a total of 88 possible noun endings. We'll get to that in a second. First, let's look at the other noun in the first phrase of John 1, archi. If we look at all the forms of this noun, we again see 8 endings. These are different from the endings for logos. Yodel only shows us 7, but that's because there's no genitive plural form of archi in the New Testament, but it does theoretically exist. If archi is used as a subject, it's a nominative case, and it has the e and the e endings. If a noun is used as a possessive, it's the genitive case, and has the is and the on endings. If a noun is the indirect object, it's the dative case, and it has the e and the es endings. And if the noun is a direct object, it's the accusative case, and it has the in and the as endings. And so again, we have a pattern of 8 word endings. We have 4 cases, and each noun can be either singular or plural in that case. And we can see lots of other nouns that follow this pattern. Again, we have singular nouns on the left and plural on the right. And then we have 4 rows, always in this order: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. So we've seen 2 of the 11 patterns of 8. One that logos and a bunch of similar nouns follow, and a different pattern that archi and a bunch of other nouns follow. Each pattern of 8 is composed of 4 rows of cases and 2 columns of quantity. How can we start creating a mental model of the other 9 patterns? If you look very closely, you'll see that there's a little superscript next to each noun. This superscript tells us which of the 11 patterns of 8 the noun follows. Archi follows pattern 1.1. Logos follows pattern 2.1. All 11 patterns can be found if we click on the 2 hashtags in the key. Here we can see all 11 patterns. In each pattern, we have the singular word endings on the left and the plural on the right. The first line is the endings for the nominative or subject form. The second line has the 2 genitive or possessive endings. The third line has the dative or indirect object endings. And the fourth line has the 2 direct object or accusative endings. So if we have a noun we want to use in a sentence, how do we know which of these 11 patterns to use? The answer is that each noun belongs to one and only one of these patterns. We use pattern 1.1 when the nominative singular form of the noun, that's the standard form in the upper left corner, ends with the eta, like archi. We use 2.1 when the noun is not neuter, in other words, it's masculine or feminine, And its standard form, its nominative singular form, ends in omicron sigma, the os sound, as in logos. You can see that all the other patterns have similar types of criteria. And as you read in Yodel, and as you try to notice patterns, Yodel will help you know which pattern to use with the superscript. You'll see that some of the criteria, but not all, require you to know the gender of the noun. But we haven't talked about genders yet. Every noun is assigned one grammatical gender. It could be masculine, feminine, or neuter. This isn't about biological gender, it's just a category that the language uses. To know it, you have to just memorize it when you memorize the word. So let's say you have a noun. The noun in its standard nominative singular form is anthropos, meaning man. You see that it has an omicron sigma ending. You see that pattern 2.1 and pattern 3.1 both apply to nouns that end in omicron sigma. So now we need to know the gender. Anthropos is a masculine noun. We mostly have to memorize the gender when we memorize the word, but there are some general patterns. Many nouns that end in omicron sigma are masculine, and many nouns that end in eta or alpha are feminine. Over time, you'll start seeing more gender patterns as you learn more nouns. So since anthropos is a non-neuter gender and ends in omicron sigma, we know it'll be a 2.1 noun. Perfect. Now we've narrowed it down from the 88 endings to just 8 endings. We know we're going to be using one of these 8 endings because only these endings apply to anthropos. But now we need to look at how we want to use the noun in a sentence. Do we want it to be singular or plural? Let's say we want it to be plural, so not man, but men. Okay? Now we've narrowed it down to these 4 endings. Now, do we want to use this noun as a subject, a possessive, an indirect object, or a direct object? Let's say we want to use it as a possessive, which is genitive, which is the purple, line number 2. So we apply the omega nu ending, and instead of anthropos, man, it's anthropon, of men. And in fact, if we look at John 1:4, we see the word anthropon, which is genitive or possessive, purple case, and means of men. And we can see the superscript of 2.1 means it's using pattern 2.1. Now, the thing you're most likely to have trouble with is the cases. This is why they are color-coded, and this is why you can click on any of the definitions in the key and get a very brief reminder of what each one means. You will see that in ancient Greek, the word endings change a lot. Anthropos turns into anthropon. Theos turns into theon. And this happens not just for nouns, but for articles and adjectives and verbs as well. The highly variable word endings are called inflections. Ancient Greek is often called a highly inflected language because of this. When we change the ending of a noun or pronoun or article, we call it a declension. When we change the end of a verb, we call it a conjugation. You may be familiar with other languages, how they conjugate verbs, but this may be the first time you've seen a declension applied to nouns. One of the main troubles of learning ancient Greek is that the language is so highly inflected. There are so many variations of each word. Yodel helps you recognize these variations, declensions, and conjugations as you read. Articles in ancient Greek are one of your best friends for figuring out a noun's number, case, and gender. Before we jump into Greek, let's ground ourselves in English. An article in English is the, or a, or an, as in the store, a house, an apple. These little words are called articles. The is a definite article because it points to a specific thing. A and an are indefinite articles because they point to something more general. Greek also has articles, but they work a little differently. Greek articles change form depending on number, case, and gender, and they do not distinguish between the definite and indefinite. There's only one article in ancient Greek, but it takes on different forms to show you the grammatical role of the noun it belongs to. This is huge. If a noun in Greek has an article and you know your article forms, you can quickly tell the noun's case, gender, and number. That's incredibly helpful, especially when you're dealing with an unfamiliar or irregular noun. The article is like a flag waving over the noun saying, Here's what I'm doing in this sentence. If you want to see all the different article variations laid out clearly, you can just click on the article item in the key and the full chart will pop up for you. You can see that this is laid out just like the nouns with singular and plural, nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative, and then masculine, feminine, and neuter. Let's look at an example. In John 1, in the Yodel reader, you can see this little red O before logos. That's the masculine nominative singular article. Then a few words later, we see ton before theon. That's the masculine accusative singular article. They are both the article, but the form changes to match the role the noun is playing in the sentence. So what does that tell us? Because logos has o in front of it, we know that logos is singular, nominative, and masculine. Because theon has ton in front of it, we know that theon is singular, accusative, and masculine. The article, when present, tells you right away how the noun is functioning in the sentence. But here's something else to notice. In ologos, the o is translated into English as the. But in ton theon, the ton, which is the exact same article just in a different form, isn't translated at all. It's just left out. And that's an important lesson. Just because you see an article in Greek doesn't mean it will always come across as the in English. Sometimes the article will be translated as the, sometimes it will be translated as a or an, and sometimes it won't be translated as an article at all. Likewise, sometimes a Greek noun appears without an article, and in English it still gets translated with the or a, depending on the context. The actual English rendering depends on the flow of the sentence and the translator's judgment. Your job as a reader is to notice what the article is telling you about the noun in Greek before you worry about how it will sound in English. Again, you don't need to memorize these endings. Just knowing the concept allows you to start seeing this pattern over time. Focus on reading out loud for comprehension and fluency, not on memorizing. If this is your first time hearing these concepts, I imagine they are extremely overwhelming. So let's go through some examples so we can get some experience recognizing noun cases. In John 1:31, we have kago uki dinafton. Kago is the red nominative case because it's the subject of the sentence. We'll always see the nominative in red. Afton is the accusative case because it's the direct object of the verb. If you have trouble remembering what a direct object is, we can look at the definition. A direct object answers the question, you verbed what? In this case, you knew what? You knew him. So him is the direct object, which makes it accusative. In John 1:33, we have ekinos mipen. Ekinos is nominative because it's the subject of the sentence. We'll always see the nominative in red. Mi is the indirect object, so it's the dative case. If we forget what an indirect object is, the indirect object answers the question, to whom? To whom did he say? To me. So me is dative. In John 1:34, we see oti utos estin oios tutheu. In this phrase, there are two nominative nouns, utos, this, and ios, son. At first glance, you might expect ios to be in the accusative case, since the accusative typically answers the question, verbed what? For example, asking, this is what, would suggest the answer, the son, implying accusative. However, when we consult the grammatical notes, we find that a nominative noun is usually the subject of a sentence. In this case, though, estin, is a linking verb. It functions like an equal sign. It links utos, this, and oios, the son, as being the same entity. Because of this linking through the verb estin, oios is not an object but a predicate nominative, a noun that renames or describes the subject and therefore remains in the nominative case. Then we have tutheu, which is genitive because the genitive case answers the question whose, of what, or of whom. And here we want to say of God. Let's look again at our cases in the key. If we click on genitive case, we'll see that it's used to indicate possession, but it's also used after certain prepositions. Okay? If we look at the dative, it represents the indirect object, but it's also used after certain prepositions. And of course, the accusative case is used when you need a direct object, but also after certain prepositions. First off, what is a preposition? We can click on the preposition item in the key. A preposition is a word that helps you describe one thing in relation to something else. Prepositions are words like on, under, above, near, into, out of, toward, before, after, during, since, until. If you don't know what a preposition is, that's fine, because they're circled in the Yodel reader. So we have en, which means in. We have pros, which means with or toward or at. We have the, which is a shortened form of dia, which means through or because of. And we have horis, which means without. You'll also notice that the prepositions are color-coded just like the nouns. Prepositions themselves don't have a case and don't change their endings. It's not correct to say, for example, that en is in the dative case. The reason prepositions are color-coded is because prepositions have rules for what types of cases can follow them. For example, the only case that can follow en is a dative case noun. Only nouns in the accusative form can follow pros, and only nouns in the genitive form can follow horis. However, the preposition dia can be followed by either a genitive or an accusative, and the use of either in the New Testament is in proportion to the case color represented in the preposition. So about 55 or maybe 60% of the time that you see dia, it will be followed by the genitive, and the rest of the time, it will be followed by the accusative. If you want to see how all the prepositions are configured, you can click again on the preposition in the key. En is always followed by a dative and means in. Is is always followed by the accusative. Ek is always followed by the genitive. Epi is kind of crazy and seems like it's kind of followed by anything. I can't figure out a rhyme or reason why. If you know, put it in the comments because I don't see much of a logical pattern there. Dia is interesting because when it's followed by a genitive, it means through. But when followed by the accusative, it means because of. Kata is also interesting. The vast majority of the time, it's followed by the accusative and means according to. But about 10% of the time, it's followed by the genitive and it means against. Meta is almost always followed by a genitive and means with, except when it's followed by an accusative and it means after, and so on through the list. Again, this isn't something you need to memorize initially, but you want to notice it and be aware that it exists so that you can make sense of how the language is put together as you read. So that was a ton, that was a lot. But now you know all the basics. So let's get back to John 1 and start walking through each phrase and see why each sentence is put together the way it is. Let's put what we've learned into practice. En is always followed by the dative, and logos is the subject, so it makes sense that it's nominative. Logos is the subject, and pros is always followed by the accusative. Here we have a linking verb, was. God was the Word. The word is just a renaming of the subject through a to be linking verb. So the word is a predicate nominative, which is in the nominative case. Utos is the subject, and we have two prepositions that are followed by their respective required cases. Here, panta, or all things, is the subject, which is correctly nominative, and we have a preposition, dia, that can be followed by either a genitive or an accusative. If we click on the, we can see that when paired with the genitive, dia means through. When paired with the accusative, it means because of. Here we have a prepositional phrase at the beginning and a subject at the end. If we were to flip that around, we'd say, udein, not even one thing, eyeneto, became or came into being, horisaftu, without him. And there's no surprises on the nominative and genitive there. Here we have a subject and a verb. In 4, we have a dative after its preposition, and then the subject, which is correctly nominative. Here we have another predicate nominative, where the light is a renaming of the life through a to be linking verb, in, which is a variant of imi, to be. And we've seen how anthropos means man, but anthropon means of men. 5 starts with the nominative subject and a dative prepositional phrase. And then the darkness did not overcome what? Overcome is our verb, and the accusative answers the question, overcame what? Overcame it, which answers our question and tells us it is the accusative. In 6, again, we have the nominative subject and para, which can be paired with nouns of all 3 cases depending on what you're trying to say. In this case, we want to say from God, so we choose the genitive, theou. And if we click on para, we can see the different meanings with the different cases. Here's an interesting one. You might think Ioannis is a predicate nominative because it renames the subject through a linking verb, was. Even though there's a linking verb in the English translation, there is no linking verb in the Greek. And Ioannis simply renames the subject. When you have a renaming like this, it's called an apposition. It's like if you were to say, my friend John is learning ancient Greek. John is just renaming my friend. That's called an apposition. But the bottom line is that an apposition has the same case as the thing it's renaming, the nominative in this case. Be aware that you can also have an apposition in other cases as well, not just nominative. For example, I could say, I gave a present to my friend John. My friend is dative because it answers the question, to whom? And so John would also be a dative apposition. In the first phrase of 7, there's nothing surprising there, but you might be surprised that there's no subject in the second phrase. There's no explicit subject, but the verb martirisi means he might testify, or she might testify, or it might testify. So from the context and the verb's ending, it's understood that the subject is he. And then we have the genitive after the preposition, and then we have another nominative subject and a preposition. In 8, we have tovos, which is the predicate nominative with the linking verb to be, even though it's a little tricky because the nouns are right next to each other and there's no verb between them. The verb in is a to be linking verb, and tophos renames or redefines ekinos. And again, in the second phrase, we're seeing no noun, but it's understood by the ending of the verb and the context of the sentence. The noun is he, so that's how it's translated. At this point, we're going to go a little bit faster and not dwell on the prepositions or the predicate nominatives, because I feel like we've seen those and we probably have a feel for those. In verse 9, we have ophotizi panta anthropon. Who or which enlightens every man? Enlightens what? Enlightens every man. Because every man answers the question of what we're enlightening, it's the direct object, which is correctly accusative. Και ο κόσμος αυτόν ουκ έγνω. And the world him not knew. Not knew what? Not knew him. So it is accusative, αυτόν. We see the same pattern in verse 11. And the own him not received. They did not receive what? Him, accusative. In verse 12, as many as, however, received what? Received him, accusative. And then in the second phrase, he gave what? He gave authority, accusative. To whom? To them, which is correctly dative. Remember, dative answers the question, to whom? And then in the next phrase, to be what? To be children. So children is accusative. Whose children? God's children. So God is genitive. Remember, genitive answers the question, whose, of what, or of whom. In 14, we have another predicate nominative. Egeneto means to become, and like to be is a linking verb, essentially acting like an equal sign between both nouns. Και εθεασάμεθα την δόξαν αυτού. We εθεασάμεθα what? Την δόξαν, the glory. So that's accusative. Whose glory? His glory. So him is genitive. Πλήρης χάριτος και αληθείας. full of grace and of truth. You're seeing that genitive is often translated as of the noun, which makes sense. In 16, imis pantes elavomen, we have all received what? Grace, accusative. In 18, theon udis eoraken popote. No one has ever seen what? God, accusative. So that's the end of the first section of the New Testament, and we've looked at prepositions and read subjects and read predicate nominatives. We've seen the brown accusative a lot. We've also seen a lot of purple genitives, but we haven't seen many of the datives in blue. So let's take a quick look at a few of those through the rest of the chapter to get a sense of how they're used. Remember, the blue dative answers the question, to whom? In 22, we see ipan un afto. They said, therefore, to him. Now, this is a pronoun, not a noun. A pronoun is a word that takes place of the main noun in the sentence. The word him, afto, takes place of the word Jesus. When we get to verse 31, we see Israel acting as the indirect object, the noun to whom something is given. Alina fanerothi to Israel, but that he might be revealed to whom? To Israel. In 33, we have another dative pronoun, me, to me. So the dative can often be found by asking to whom. Note that the dative will not always be translated with to in English. For example, in verse 26, we have a dative pronoun, but it's a little tricky because it's not translated as to them in English. The to whom question is a good general trick, but really what the dative is getting at is who is receiving the action. Most verbs that give, show, say, teach, or promise to someone will normally put the person to whom it's given or said in the dative. Again, that won't always be translated with the English word to, but the idea of the person receiving an action is still core to the standard dative form. Lastly, there are some verbs that don't follow a neat rule, but just prefer that they are followed by the dative. In verse 36, we have Geemvlepsas to Jesu, and having looked at Jesus. Even though Jesus is in the dative, we wouldn't translate this as looked to Jesus. That would mean something different. And Jesus isn't really receiving anything. So why is this in the dative? There's a similar example in 37. Ke ikoluthisan to Jesu. They followed Jesus. In English, both of these would take a direct object. Having looked at what? Jesus. They followed what? Jesus. But in ancient Greek, certain verbs prefer the dative. The verbs that take the dative object are verbs of following, trusting, serving, helping, and looking attentively. We don't need to go through that exhaustively, but just kind of be on the lookout for that as you read. These exceptions are a good reminder that grammar always has core patterns plus lots of little exceptions. As a beginner, focus on learning and applying the big, reliable rules. When you spot something that doesn't fit, don't panic. Just note it, move on, and revisit it later. Your solid grasp of the main rules will then make those exceptions stand out and be much easier to master in the future. Before we wrap up, I want to briefly talk about adjectives. Adjectives describe nouns. Adjectives answer the question, which one, what kind, how many. Let's take a look at some adjectives in John 1. You can see that adjectives are marked in Yodel with a small red dash under them. So let's find some of those. In John 1:9, we see in tophos to lithinon. He was the light. What kind of light? True light, alithinon. Because alithinon describes tophos, the adjective has to match the noun it describes in case. You can see they're both nominative, and in gender and quantity. And you can see that because phos is neuter and singular, the adjective alithinon is also neuter and singular. We haven't talked much about these little markers underneath the nouns, but they signify the noun's number and gender. So we have masculine singular, feminine singular, and neuter singular. Then masculine plural, feminine plural, and neuter plural. Let's look at the next line. O photisi pantanthropon. Here we see that panta is an adjective with a small red dash, and it describes man, anthropon. It tells us which one. Again, an adjective tells us which one, what kind, or how many. And we can see that the adjective matches the noun it describes in case, gender, and number. This little box indicates both are masculine and singular. Very often you'll see an adjective that doesn't have a noun it's describing, which could seem a little funny. The reason is that the noun is understood to exist from the context. Let's look at some examples. In John 1:7, in this last phrase, we have Inapantes pistevsusin diaftu. Pantes is a nominative masculine plural adjective, but where is the noun it's describing? The noun is understood to be people, that all people might believe through him. People is excluded because it's understood from the context. If we go up to the second phrase of verse 3, we see something similar. Que horis aftu egeneto udein. And without him came into being not even one. En, meaning one, is telling us how many could not come into being without the word. So it's an adjective because it answers the question, how many? The noun it's describing is not explicitly stated. In fact, when translated into English, to make it a little clearer, you can see that the translators add the noun back in to make sure the reader knows what the word one is describing. Let's summarize as we finish up this lesson. Remember that each noun has three attributes: quantity, singular or plural; case, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative; and gender, masculine, feminine, or neuter. These are commonly organized for a single noun inside 8 boxes, with singular on the left, plural on the right, and the 4 cases on separate rows. Every noun belongs to one and only one of 11 different word-ending patterns. You can know which word endings a given noun uses by looking at the ending of its standard nominative singular form and sometimes knowing the gender. Once you know which pattern to follow, you just need to know how you want to use the noun in the sentence and choose the right case and the right quantity. Remember that the 4 cases largely correspond to the noun's function in the sentence: the subject, possession, indirect object, and direct object. But you'll also commonly see the genitive, dative, and accusative after certain prepositions. That's it for nouns. If you've made it this far, you should celebrate. Remember, the goal isn't to memorize every case and pattern right away. The goal is to build a strong mental model of how the grammar works, so that when you read, you can recognize the patterns as they appear and learn naturally over time. In the next video, we'll continue our big picture tour of grammar by looking at ancient Greek verbs. You'll start to see how actions are expressed in the language and how verbs interact with the noun cases that we've just covered. And if you haven't already, check out the tools at yodel.com. They're designed to support everything that we've covered here. And most importantly, just start reading. Good luck.